Daniel Brooks had always been a man of discipline and resilience. A former Marine and a devoted single father, he had spent years working tirelessly to provide his daughter Sophie with a safe and stable home. When he first moved into Willow Creek Estates, he believed he had found the perfect place, a quiet, picturesque neighborhood with well-manicured lawns, elegant houses, and a seemingly tight-knit community. It was everything he had ever wanted for his little girl. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and unsubscribe, so you won't miss out on more thrilling stories. Drop a comment below with your thoughts and share this story with those who need to hear it. Turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our latest videos. See you in the At first, life in Willow Creek seemed ideal. The air was fresh, the streets were clean, and the neighbors were polite, if not a little distant. Daniel was used to keeping to himself, and as long as Sophie was happy, nothing else mattered. But something about the neighborhood felt off. It was subtle at first, small, unsettling details that were easy to brush off. On the very first night in their new home, Daniel was jolted awake by a loud knock at the door. It was well past midnight, and when he checked, no one was there. The porch light flickered as a cold chill crawled up his spine. Thinking it was just some kids messing around, he locked the door and went back to bed. Then came the whispers. Sophie, only 11 years old, started behaving strangely. One evening, as Daniel passed by her bedroom, he heard her whispering softly. Peeking through the door, he saw her sitting on her bed, speaking to an empty corner of the room. "Sweetheart, who are you talking to?" he asked. Sophie turned, her face pale under the dim glow of her nightlight. "The lady," she said simply. Daniel's stomach twisted. "What lady?" Sophie pointed to the empty corner, her small fingers trembling slightly. "She doesn't like when you ask about her." A heavy silence fell between them. Daniel forced a chuckle, trying to push away the unease creeping into his bones. "It's just your imagination, kiddo. Maybe all the excitement from moving is playing tricks on you." But deep down, he wasn't convinced. The disturbances only grew worse. Lights in the house flickered unpredictably, shadows seemed to shift unnaturally along the walls, and at night Daniel swore he could hear the sound of footsteps pacing outside his bedroom door. Every time he checked, the hallway was empty. Then there were the neighbors. They were polite but distant, too distant. The few interactions Daniel had were off-putting, almost rehearsed. It was as if they were all following some unspoken rule. Nobody walked outside after dark, windows were always shut tight at night, and if anyone saw Daniel looking around too closely, they quickly averted their eyes and hurried away. One evening, while taking out the trash, he overheard two neighbors whispering in hushed, urgent tones. "Why did they let another one move in?" one woman murmured. "They never last long," the man beside her replied. "The HOA makes sure of that." Daniel froze. What the hell did that mean? A feeling of unease coiled in his chest. He had faced war zones, had seen things most men wouldn't dare imagine, but this fear was different. It was creeping, slow, and insidious. Then he met Martha Caldwell. She arrived at his doorstep the very next morning. Tall, elegant, and exuding an unsettling aura of authority, she introduced herself as the head of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, HOA. Her presence alone made his skin crawl. "Welcome to Willow Creek, Mr. Brooks," she said, her voice smooth yet oddly hollow. "I trust you're settling in well." Daniel nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "We're doing fine." Martha smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That's good. We have very high standards here. I trust you'll do everything to follow the rules." Something about the way she said it sent a sharp chill down Daniel's spine. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a warning, and in that moment he knew. He had just walked into something far darker than he had ever imagined. Daniel Brooks had met plenty of people in his life, some good, some bad, and some who simply gave off the wrong energy. But Martha Caldwell, she was something else entirely. The way she stared at him during their first conversation had unsettled him in a way that was hard to explain. Her eyes, dark and piercing, seemed to look straight through him, as if she were studying something beneath his skin. From the moment she set foot on his porch, Daniel knew she didn't like him being here. At first, her disapproval came in subtle, veiled ways. A slight frown when she passed by his house, a forced smile whenever their eyes met. But it didn't take long before her passive aggression turned into something much worse. It started with the notices. The first letter arrived just 3 days after their encounter, neatly tucked into his mailbox. It was a formal warning from the Willow Creek Homeowners Association about minor violations. Daniel unfolded the crisp white paper and read, "Violation. Trash bins left outside for more than 2 hours. Fine, $50. Daniel frowned. He was certain he had brought the trash bins in within the hour after pickup. Brushing it off as a mistake, he paid the fine. A few days later, another letter appeared. Violation. Lawn not trimmed to HOA standards. Fine, $100. Daniel stared at his yard. The grass was perfectly cut. Then came more letters, each one accusing him of breaking increasingly absurd rules. Leaving porch lights on past 10 p.m., Sophie's bike being left unattended in their own driveway, a non-compliant mailbox that needed to be repainted. Every single violation came with a fine, and every time Daniel tried to challenge them, HOA responded with the same cold, bureaucratic response. Rules are rules, Mr. Brooks. Compliance is expected. But here was the thing. His neighbors weren't getting fined for the exact same issues. One night, Daniel took a walk around the neighborhood and paid attention. Trash bins stood outside other houses well past the 2-hour mark. He saw at least 3 homes with untrimmed lawns and mailboxes in all sorts of colors. No one else was getting fined. This wasn't about rules. This was personal. The next morning, while drinking his coffee on the porch, Daniel saw Martha standing across the street, watching him. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just stood there, perfectly still, with that same eerie, unreadable expression. Sophie peeked out the window and whispered, "Bo oi, ba I o jo ka jem." Daniel's grip on his coffee mug tightened. "What do you mean?" "I woke up at 3 in the morning. She was standing there." A chill crawled down his spine. That night he stayed up late, keeping an eye on the street. By 2 a.m., the streetlights flickered. By 3 a.m., Martha was there, just standing, watching, waiting. Daniel knew then this wasn't just a power-hungry woman running an HOA. There was something very, very wrong with her. Daniel Brooks had always prided himself on his ability to adapt. Whether it was in the military or as a single father, he had learned to pick his battles. But this wasn't a battle. It was a war. The letters kept coming, each one colder and more absurd than the last. Violation, wind chimes too loud at night. Violation, garage door left open for more than 5 minutes. Violation, curtains not in an approved neutral shade. Each fine was steeper than the last. It was as if someone was testing how much pressure he could take before breaking. But the worst part, it wasn't just the fines, it was the things happening at night. One evening, Daniel was working in his garage when he heard footsteps outside his house. Not just footsteps, slow, deliberate pacing. He stepped outside, but the street was empty. The streetlights flickered for a moment before plunging the sidewalk into darkness. Then he noticed it. His trash cans had been moved. They were perfectly aligned when he left them, but now they were tilted at an odd angle, forming a deliberate pattern on the pavement. A warning. Daniel's heart pounded as he scanned the street. No one. And yet he could feel something watching him. The next morning, he decided to confront one of his neighbors, Paul Mercer, a quiet man in his 60s who had lived in Willow Creek Estates for years. "Paul," Daniel started, keeping his voice even, "do you ever get these violation notices?" Paul hesitated. His eyes darted toward Martha Caldwell's house before he muttered, "Not anymore." "What does that mean?" Daniel pressed. Paul swallowed hard. "It means I stopped fighting back." Before Daniel could ask more, Paul turned and walked inside, shutting the door behind him. That night, the whispers started. Not inside the house. Outside. Daniel woke up to the sound of Sophie crying. "Daddy, they're whispering again." Daniel jumped out of bed, his muscles tensed. "Who's whispering?" Sophie pointed at the window. "The people outside." His blood ran cold. He crept to the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. The front yard was empty, but the whispers were still there. Low, indecipherable voices, like a dozen people muttering just beyond his line of sight. He stepped outside, the whispers immediately stopped. But the moment he turned his back, they started again. A chilling realization sank into his bones. The HOA wasn't just watching him, they were waiting. For what? He didn't know. But whatever game they were playing, Daniel refused to lose. Daniel Brooks had been through hell before. He had survived war zones, sleepless nights, and the crushing weight of responsibility as a single father. But nothing compared to the sinking dread he felt when he opened the letter waiting for him in his mailbox that morning. Stamped in bold red ink across the top were two words that made his blood run cold. Foreclosure notice. His stomach twisted as he unfolded the paper with trembling hands. According to the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, Daniel had accrued thousands of dollars in unpaid fines, and as a result, his home was being seized and put up for auction. This had to be a mistake. He had never missed a mortgage payment. He had paid every ridiculous fine they threw at him, even the ones that made no sense. And yet, according to the notice, he had been warned multiple times and failed to comply. But that was a lie. A calculated, orchestrated lie. His hands clenched into fists as rage burned in his chest. He stormed into his house, grabbing every single letter, notice, and receipt he had kept as proof. He wasn't going to let them take his home without a fight. By the time he reached the HOA office, his pulse was pounding so hard it was all he could hear. The receptionist barely glanced at him before saying in a detached, robotic voice, "The decision is final, Mr. Brooks." Daniel slammed the foreclosure notice onto the counter. "Like hell it is. Someone needs to explain how I suddenly owe thousands in fines when I was never informed." A shadow moved behind him, Martha Caldwell. She stepped forward, the ever-present eerie smile on her lips. "Mr. Brooks," she cooed, her voice smooth but filled with venom. "We've done everything we can to be accommodating. But rules are rules." Daniel turned to face her, his jaw clenched. "This isn't about rules. This is about you wanting me gone." Her smile didn't waver. "If that were true," she said lightly, "why would I waste my time with legal proceedings? If I wanted you gone, you'd be gone already." Something in her tone made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The whispers, the strange noises, the things moving at night. This wasn't just HOA corruption. Something else was at play here. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Who are you, really?" For the first time, her expression flickered. It was subtle, gone in an instant, but Daniel saw it, a crack in her perfectly constructed mask. Then she simply smiled again. "You'll find out soon enough." Something ice-cold curled in his stomach. As he turned to leave, he caught sight of the HOA board members, a group of unnervingly well-dressed homeowners standing behind Martha, watching him with unreadable expressions. And then he noticed it. None of them blinked. Not once. Daniel forced himself to keep walking, but deep down, he knew. This wasn't just about his house anymore. It was about survival. The day of the auction arrived with an eerie stillness, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable to happen. Daniel Brooks had barely slept the night before. He had spent hours going over every piece of evidence, every receipt, every fine. None of it mattered. The HOA had made sure of that. Sophie clung to his side, her small fingers digging into his arm as they stood outside the HOA clubhouse, watching as people gathered. Investors in sharp suits, real estate developers with cold, calculating eyes, and neighbors who whispered in hushed voices, all of them were waiting for the feeding frenzy to begin. To them, this was just another business transaction. To Daniel, it was the destruction of everything he had built. And then there was Martha Caldwell. She stood near the front, dressed in her signature beige cardigan, clipboard in hand, practically glowing with satisfaction. This was her moment. She had orchestrated it perfectly, and now she would watch him be erased from the neighborhood like he had never existed. The HOA board members flanked her, standing unnaturally still, their blank expressions never changing. Daniel swore he hadn't seen any of them blink once. The auctioneer stepped up to the podium, clearing his throat. "We are here for the foreclosure auction of 413 Willow Creek Drive. Opening bid starts at $100,000. Daniel felt sick. His home was worth 3 times that amount, but HOA auctions were never about fairness. Someone was about to steal his home for pennies on the dollar. A hand shot up. $100,000. Another followed. $150,000. Martha's buyer, a wealthy investor in a crisp navy blue suit, placed his bid without even looking up from his phone. His offer was low but confident, knowing full well that no one else would be allowed to outbid him. Daniel clenched his fists. It was all rigged. Then, just as Martha turned to give Daniel a triumphant smirk, something shifted in the crowd. A man strode confidently into the auction space, his black suit crisp, his posture commanding. No one recognized him, but the moment he spoke, the entire atmosphere changed. $500,000. Silence. The auctioneer hesitated, his mouth opening slightly as if he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. Martha's expression darkened. The investor beside her turned, his smug confidence crumbling into confusion. Before the auctioneer could even respond, the man raised his voice again. $1 million. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. What the hell was happening? Martha's lips parted in shock, her carefully constructed facade cracking for the first time. She spun toward the HOA board members, her expression a mixture of panic and fury. The auctioneer fumbled with his microphone, voice shaky. 1 million going once. Going twice. Martha's buyer didn't even bother responding. There was no way he could match that price. Sold. The auctioneer slammed his gavel down. Daniel barely had time to process what had just happened before the mystery man turned toward him with an unsettlingly knowing smile. "Mr. Brooks," he said, his voice smooth but firm, "we need to talk." And for the first time since this nightmare began, Martha Caldwell looked afraid. Daniel Brooks had spent months fighting a battle he wasn't sure he could win. But now someone had just spent $1 million to stop the auction and throw the entire HOA into chaos. The mystery man, tall, composed, and exuding quiet authority, stepped forward, extending a firm hand. "Mr. Brooks, my name is Jonathan Hale," he said. "I specialize in exposing corrupt homeowner associations. And I've been watching this case for a long time." Daniel hesitated before shaking his hand, still trying to process what had just happened. Martha Caldwell, usually so smug and composed, had gone deathly pale. Her fingers tightened around her clipboard as she snapped, "This auction was legal. You can't just walk in here and buy the house." Jonathan turned to her with a slow, calculated smile. "Oh, the auction was legal, but the foreclosure wasn't." The crowd murmured. For the first time, people were questioning what they had just witnessed. Jonathan reached into his briefcase, pulling out a thick stack of documents. "I have evidence that Willow Creek HOA has been engaging in fraudulent fines, targeted harassment, and illegal foreclosures. And at the center of it all," he turned to Martha, his smile razor-sharp, "you." Martha's face drained of color. The board members behind her shifted uncomfortably, their rigid, unblinking stances faltering for the first time. Daniel's heart pounded as he stared at the documents Jonathan held up. Emails, internal reports, even recordings. "This is ridiculous," Martha spat. "You have no proof." Jonathan arched an eyebrow. "No proof? That's funny, considering I have emails from you to the HOA board discussing how to clean up the neighborhood." He held up a flash drive. "I also have recordings of board meetings where you openly discuss ways to drive Mr. Brooks out." The crowd's murmurs turned into angry whispers. Neighbors who had once ignored Daniel's struggles were suddenly paying attention. Some exchanged nervous glances, realizing that if this happened to him, it could happen to them too. Martha shook her head furiously. "This is a conspiracy. These are fabricated lies." Jonathan smirked. "Is it? Because I also have bank records showing money siphoned from HOA funds into your personal account. Shall we go over the lavish vacations, shopping sprees, and that little kitchen renovation you paid for with stolen HOA fees?" Martha took a shaky step back, panic creeping into her eyes. The board members did the same, slowly distancing themselves from her. Daniel gritted his teeth. After all the stress, the fear, the sleepless nights, it had all been a setup. And now everyone could see it. Jonathan wasn't done. He turned back to the crowd. "This HOA has been targeting homeowners for years. falsifying violations to push them out so they could sell properties to hand-picked buyers for massive profits. A ripple of shock spread through the bystanders. And in some cases, Jonathan added, voice deadly serious, the motivation wasn't just financial, it was racial. The weight of his words hung thick in the air. Daniel clenched his fists as he saw the truth sinking in for the residents. Some of them had suspected something was wrong, but no one had dared to challenge Martha before. Now she had nowhere left to hide. For the first time in months, Daniel felt something shift. The power was no longer in Martha's hands. Martha Caldwell had spent years ruling Willow Creek Estates with an iron grip, weaving a web of control so tight that no one dared to defy her. But now, that web was unraveling right before her eyes. The crowd had turned on her. The neighbors she once commanded with fear and intimidation were now whispering, eyes darting between Jonathan Hale and the mountain of evidence he had just exposed. Martha sputtered, her carefully constructed facade cracking. You can't do this. You don't have authority here." Jonathan smirked. "I don't need authority. The evidence speaks for itself." Martha's hands trembled as she tried to regain control. "You're all fools if you believe this man. This is my community. I built this neighborhood. I protected it." A voice from the crowd, Paul Mercer, the quiet man who had once warned Daniel to stop fighting back, spoke up. "Protected it?" Paul scoffed. "You bled us dry, Martha. You destroyed families, you drove people out of their own homes, and we let you do it." Another neighbor chimed in. "My sister lost her house because of you." The anger in the crowd grew. Martha had spent years silencing them, but now her power was slipping through her fingers like sand. And then, as if the final nail had been hammered into the coffin, 2 police officers stepped out from the crowd. Martha's face went sheet white. One of the officers, a stern-looking woman with a badge glinting under the afternoon sun, spoke clearly. "Martha Caldwell, we need to have a word with you." Martha took a shaky step back, clutching her clipboard as if it could somehow protect her. "This is ridiculous. I didn't do anything wrong." Jonathan folded his arms, watching the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. "Actually, you did. Multiple things, in fact." The officer continued, voice firm. "Miss Caldwell, you're under investigation for fraud, harassment, and misuse of HOA funds." Martha let out a strangled laugh, her eyes darting desperately toward the HOA board members for support. But none of them met her gaze. The same people who had once followed her without question were now distancing themselves, slipping away like rats abandoning a sinking ship. Martha shook her head violently. "You can't arrest me. This is my HOA, my rules. I make the decisions here." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Not anymore." One of the officers pulled out a small notepad, flipping through pages. "We have bank records, witness testimonies, and emails backing up every claim against you." Another neighbor, a woman who had been silent up until now, stepped forward. "You tried to ruin my family." Her voice shook, but she kept going. "I was too afraid to say anything. But not anymore." Martha let out a shriek of frustration. "This is a conspiracy. You're all against me. This neighborhood will fall apart without me." But no one listened anymore. The officer stepped closer. "Martha Caldwell, you are under arrest." The moment those words left her lips, Martha lost it. She thrashed as the officers grabbed her arms, kicking, screaming, her face twisted in rage. "You will regret this. All of you. This isn't over." But the crowd, the same people who once feared her, burst into applause. It was over. Daniel exhaled deeply, a weight lifting off his chest for the first time in months. He turned to Jonathan. "So what happens now?" Jonathan smirked. "Now? We clean up the mess she left behind." Martha Caldwell had ruled through fear, deception, and manipulation for years. But now she was powerless. The HOA board members who once stood behind her had abandoned ship. The neighborhood had turned against her, and the law had finally caught up with her sins. As the officers secured her wrists in handcuffs, she thrashed violently, her voice shrill and filled with venom. "You think this is over? You think you can just erase me? I am Willow Creek. I made this place what it is." Jonathan Hale didn't flinch. He simply held up the stack of evidence, the documents, emails, and financial records that sealed her fate. Actually, Martha, he said, his voice calm, what you made was a house of lies. And now it's all crumbling. The officers began leading her toward their patrol car, but Martha wasn't done fighting. She kicked, screamed, and cursed everyone in sight. Her once polished demeanor had shattered completely, replaced with pure, unfiltered rage. You ungrateful cowards! I protected this place. You will all beg me to come back. A man in the crowd, one of the many homeowners she had tormented over the years, spoke up. We're not afraid of you anymore, Martha. And just like that, the spell was broken. The crowd erupted in cheers. The people she had ruled through fear were finally free. Daniel Brooks watched as the patrol car doors slammed shut, muffling Martha's continued screaming. He had fought battles before, but this was the first time he had won one without throwing a single punch. Jonathan clapped him on the back. It's done. She's done. Daniel exhaled, a deep, long breath he hadn't even realized he was holding. For the first time in months, he wasn't on edge. No more violation notices, no more threats, no more HOA watching his every move. But before he could even process it, Jonathan turned toward him with a knowing look. Now about your house. Daniel tensed. The house, the auction, the foreclosure. Had it all been for nothing? Jonathan's smirk widened. Relax, it's yours again, free and clear. Daniel blinked. Wait. What? Jonathan crossed his arms. I didn't buy it to take it from you. I bought it to give it back. The weight of those words hit Daniel like a freight train. His home, his, no debt, no mortgage, no HOA breathing down his neck. Just a house, a real home. Sophie, who had been watching from the porch, ran straight into his arms, tears streaming down her face. Daddy, are we staying? Daniel hugged her tightly, pressing a kiss to her hair. Yeah, baby. We're staying. Martha Caldwell had spent years playing God, deciding who belonged and who didn't. But in the end, she had lost everything. And Daniel had won.